My dad never really talks about the Army. It's kind of embarrassing, honestly. Like he was there but won't say anything about it. My son Jason said to his recruiter, not realizing I'd stepped into the next room to grab coffee and could hear every word through the thin apartment wall. I stood there for a moment, mug in hand, absorbing the particular sting of hearing your own son describe your silence as an embarrassment rather than anything else. My name is Master Sergeant Daniel Webb, United States Army, retired. I was 59 years old the day I overheard my son apologize, essentially, for my quietness to a stranger, evaluating whether he was fit to enlist. And I stood in that hallway for a long moment before deciding whether to walk in or simply let the conversation continue without me. I need to explain what 24 years in the Army actually did to my relationship with talking about it, because the silence Jason found embarrassing wasn't laziness or coldness, it was something else entirely. I enlisted at 18. Spent the next 24 years moving through increasingly demanding roles, eventually specializing in a particular area of combat operations that I still, even now, discuss only in the most general terms with anyone outside a small circle of people who served alongside me. I completed 5 deployments across those years, some considerably harder than others, and I came home from the last one changed in ways that took me years to even begin to understand myself, let alone explain to a wife and young son waiting for me at home.
My wife Karen and I raised Jason mostly during the back half of my career, when deployments had become somewhat more predictable, and I was home more consistently than I'd been during his earliest years. Even during the stretches I was present, though, I want to be honest that I wasn't always fully present in the way a father probably should be. There's a particular kind of internal static that follows certain kinds of service home, a persistent background hum of hypervigilance and compartmentalized memory that makes ordinary domestic life feel, at times, oddly distant, like watching your own family through slightly fogged glass. I remember specific moments from Jason's childhood where I'd catch myself scanning a crowded restaurant for exits before I'd even sat down, or waking instantly and completely alert at small nighttime sounds that Karen slept straight through without noticing. Jason, as a young boy, sometimes asked why I did certain things, why I always sat facing the door, why I flinched at fireworks on the 4th of July when other dads seemed to enjoy them without any visible reaction. I never had good answers for him at the time, usually deflecting with something vague about old habits, never quite finding the words to explain the actual source of those habits in a way appropriate for a child to hear. I never explained any of this to Jason as he grew up, partly because I genuinely didn't have the language for it myself during most of his childhood, and partly because I'd absorbed over years of service a deep cultural instinct common among men of my particular specialty within the Army, which is that talking about the specifics of what you'd done and seen wasn't just uncomfortable, it was something closer to inappropriate, a violation of an unspoken code most of us carried without ever discussing it directly with each other, let alone with civilians, even civilians we loved. Jason grew up then with a father who was physically present but conversationally guarded about an entire dimension of his own history, filling that gap the way children often do, with assumptions built from television and movies and the occasional overheard phone call between me and one of my old service buddies, conversations conducted in a kind of clipped, coded shorthand that Jason absorbed the tone of without ever understanding the content.
I retired 8 years ago, when Jason was 17. And settled into the kind of quiet civilian life that a lot of veterans from my particular background eventually find their way toward. Deliberately unremarkable, deliberately low profile. I took a job managing logistics for a regional shipping company, work that used skills I'd developed in the Army without requiring me to discuss any of the harder context those skills came from. Jason, over the years since, developed his own interest in military service, something I'd watched with a complicated mixture of pride and quiet apprehension, understanding better than most parents exactly what that path could eventually ask of him. I never discouraged him from it, believing firmly that it wasn't my place to project my own experience onto his choices, but I also never fully explained my own history in a way that might have given him a more complete picture of what he was potentially signing up for. He turned 21 recently and began seriously exploring enlistment, working with a recruiter named Staff Sergeant Ortiz, a sharp, thorough young non-commissioned officer who took the process seriously and asked Jason detailed questions about his background and motivations, including, as it happened, questions about family military history, a fairly standard part of the broader conversation recruiters often have with potential enlistees. It was during one of these conversations, at the recruiting office rather than our apartment, that Jason apparently mentioned my service in the somewhat dismissive, embarrassed way I described at the start, explaining that I'd been in the Army for over 2 decades, but essentially never discussed any of it, framing my silence as a strange, slightly uncomfortable family quirk rather than anything with real weight behind it.
I hadn't been in the room for that particular conversation, obviously, only for the version I overheard weeks later when Jason brought Staff Sergeant Ortiz by our apartment to discuss some final paperwork. A visit that led directly to the moment I found myself standing in the hallway with a coffee mug, listening to my son characterize decades of my life as an embarrassing silence, rather than anything worth understanding more deeply. I want to be honest that my first instinct was simply to retreat quietly to the kitchen and let the visit continue without my involvement, the same instinct I'd operated on for years regarding my own service. But something in that particular framing, embarrassing, stuck with me differently than the usual vague unfamiliarity I'd grown used to from Jason over the years. There was a difference, I realized, standing in that hallway, between my son simply not knowing much about my service and my son actively feeling apologetic toward a stranger about it, and that distinction was enough to change my usual calculus. I walked back into the living room instead, coffee in hand, and joined the conversation. Staff Sergeant Ortiz, professional and thorough, eventually asked me directly, as part of the broader family background discussion, what unit I'd served with and what my occupational specialty had been. I gave him a brief, general answer, the kind I'd given hundreds of times over the years to people who didn't need or particularly want the fuller version. What I didn't fully anticipate was that Ortiz, as part of his standard due diligence process for Jason's enlistment paperwork, would later pull some publicly available historical unit information to help him better understand and speak to Jason about the kind of specialized path his father had followed, a fairly routine part of how good recruiters sometimes build context for potential enlistees interested in similar specialties. Ortiz later described that research process to me directly, explaining that what started as a fairly routine background check kept leading him deeper than he expected, cross-referencing unit designations and deployment timeframes against publicly documented operational histories, piecing together, gradually, a picture considerably more significant than the vague general answer I'd given him about my service. He told me he'd actually stopped at one point, sat back from his desk, and reread a particular section twice, needing a moment to fully absorb what he was looking at before continuing.
About a week later, Ortiz called Jason directly, sounding notably different than his usual measured professional tone, and asked if he could come by again to discuss something specific. When he arrived, he had printed a handful of pages, historical unit records, and general information about the specific specialized operations community I'd served within during a significant portion of my career. Information that, while not classified, wasn't exactly common public knowledge either, requiring some genuine research effort to compile accurately. Jason told me later that watching Ortiz's expression while explaining what he'd found had been unlike anything he'd seen from the recruiter in their previous meetings, a kind of visible recalibration happening in real time, professional composure straining slightly under what was clearly genuine surprise. Ortiz, as it turned out, had served himself in a role adjacent enough to my old specialty that he understood, in specific professional terms most civilians simply couldn't, exactly what a career like mine actually involved: the selection process, the operational tempo, the kind of sustained psychological weight that particular path carried across 2.5 decades of service. Ortiz told Jason, and later told me directly when he called to properly introduce himself again in this new context, that reading through even the general historical information about my specialty had been enough to fundamentally reframe how he understood the quiet, unassuming logistics manager who'd been sitting quietly in the corner of his son's enlistment meetings. He apologized, somewhat sheepishly, for not having recognized sooner what he was actually looking at, though I told him honestly there was nothing to apologize for, since I'd never given him or anyone else much reason to look closer. Jason, sitting through the second conversation with Ortiz, watched his recruiter's demeanor toward me shift in real time, watched something that had been, in Jason's own earlier words, an embarrassing silence transform, in the space of a single conversation, into something Ortiz clearly regarded with genuine professional respect, bordering on something closer to reverence.
After Ortiz left that second time, Jason and I sat together for a long while, and I want to describe honestly that this wasn't some triumphant cinematic moment of vindication. It was quieter and more complicated than that. Jason apologized, clearly uncomfortable, for the way he'd described me to Ortiz at first time, and I told him honestly that I understood why he'd described it that way, because from his perspective, growing up, that's genuinely what my silence had looked like, an unexplained gap rather than anything he had reason to understand as significant. We talked for hours that evening, longer than any conversation we'd had in years, Jason asking questions with a careful hesitance I hadn't seen from him before, clearly worried about pushing too hard into territory he now understood carried real weight. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, answering more openly than I expected to, not because Ortiz's discovery had somehow given me permission I hadn't had before, but because watching my own son finally understand there was something real underneath the silence made the effort of explaining it feel worthwhile in a way it hadn't before. I told him some things that day I'd never fully told him before. Not everything. There remain pieces of those 24 years I still keep entirely to myself, likely permanently, but enough that he left that conversation with a considerably fuller understanding of the path he himself was now considering following, understanding it not as some vague family quirk, but as something with real weight and real cost attached to it. I also told him something I felt was important for him to hear clearly, given that he was actively considering enlistment himself, which was that my silence over the years hadn't been about protecting some kind of impressive secret, but rather about genuinely not having found language for most of his childhood adequate to the task of explaining difficult things to a child, without either frightening him or minimizing what those experiences had actually cost me.
Jason ultimately did enlist, several months after these conversations, and our relationship in the time since has shifted into something considerably more honest than what existed before. He asks me real questions now, and I answer more of them than I used to, though I remain selective about which specifics I'm willing to revisit even now. He told me, before he left for basic training, that understanding even a fuller general outline of my service had changed how he thought about his own decision entirely, giving him a clearer, more honest sense of what he was actually choosing, rather than the somewhat romanticized picture he'd built from movies and half-understood family silence. Karen told me, a few weeks after Jason left for basic, that she'd noticed a change in me too, something she described as a slight loosening. Small moments where I'd mentioned something from my service unprompted, in ordinary conversation, in a way I simply never used to. I hadn't fully noticed it happening in myself until she pointed it out, but she was right. Something about finally being seen clearly by my own son, even partially, even imperfectly, had made the whole weight of that silence a little easier to set down, at least in small pieces, at least some of the time. If you've ever let necessary silence calcify into something the people you love mistake for indifference or embarrassment, I hope you hear this. Protecting your children from difficult truths and simply failing to ever find the right moment to share them can look identical from the outside, but they aren't the same thing, and sometimes it takes someone else entirely, a stranger with the right context, to finally show your own family the difference.